So the first Impartial Examiner. The Impartial Examiner was an anonymous Anti-Federalist printer, or I should say article writer, in Virginia. And we still don't know who wrote the Impartial Examiner essays, but let's talk about the first one, shall we? It was published in February of 1788, just as Virginia is getting ready to go do some ratification conventioning. Now, I will say several states had already ratified the Constitution at this point, but a big powerful state like Virginia voting against ratification could have hurt the Constitution's approval at large, and it may have essentially gone up in smoke, as they say. So, with the Impartial Examiner, the first one, I will note they are rather lengthy. Having already reviewed all of the Federalist Papers and reviewed the essays of Brutus, those are fairly standard newspaper article lengths, but the Impartial Examiners are very long. So this is a very, very, very brief assessment of what it says in the Impartial Examiner 1. And the first thing he really attacks is the idea of an arbitrary government versus a free government. Now, when the examiner discusses arbitrary government, he doesn't exactly use the word arbitrary like we might think of it today. He used the word arbitrary to essentially describe an authoritarian government, a king or a dictator, not necessarily with the tyrannical overtones, but just the idea that there's one person in charge or a few handful of people in charge who have absolutely nothing to do with the people themselves. They can make whatever laws they want arbitrarily if they choose, though usually they're not done for those arbitrary reasons, but essentially that's what he means by arbitrary. And the opposite of an arbitrary government, according to the examiner, is a free government, aka what they were referring to as a republican government, one that works directly for the people themselves. Now, I will say the independent examiner notes that when a government is created, governments are natural, and when they are created, there is a certain agreement between the people of a society to give up certain basic rights for the betterment of the whole. Or in other words, to secure the liberties of each individual has to give up a little bit of their independence to form the government itself. Now, that being said, the independent examiner goes really into depth in the idea that this whole new constitution is being done way too hastily. First of all, this is like 5 years after the revolution had ceased hostilities. So the American people had just overthrown a government, thrown off a government, and instituted a new one. Now, well, everyone, including the independent examiner, acknowledges that the Articles of Confederation had certain major flaws that needed correcting. It also notes that we can revise the current government instead of just overthrowing the old one. It seems a little hasty to be 5 years after getting rid of one government, putting in another one. And furthermore, why do we have to ratify this Constitution so quickly? Why has it been? It's been about 4 months since the Constitution has been presented to the people for ratification, and we have to do it right now? Why can't we take 2 or 3 years, really talk about it, maybe make some changes beforehand instead of hoping that we make amendments afterwards? Now, of course, they do make amendments. The Bill of Rights they make within a handful of years just after the new government takes hold. But again, at the time, there was no way for the independent examiner or anyone else in the colonies to know this. So there was a good amount of fear in that regard. The impartial examiner then goes on to discuss the rights themselves. He spends most of this paper really talking about the lack of a Bill of Rights and the need for a Bill of Rights. First of all, he notes that if rights are not expressly reserved, I'm going to quote it, expressly reserved in a government's constitution, then you could safely assume they are not protected and will be removed. And that is essentially what the impartial examiner in this first paper is most concerned about, is that, hey, we have this government, it doesn't say we have freedom of speech. So they can just get rid of our rights to free press. They can get rid of our rights to free speech. They can get rid of our rights to a fair and just trial because it is not expressly reserved in the Constitution. He then goes on to talk about Article 6 of the Constitution. He notes, the independent examiner even says, I know I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but he talks about Article 6 of the Constitution because that's where they have the supremacy clause. And one of the arguments the Federalists were making for why there wasn't a Bill of Rights is the states already have the Bill of Rights. And essentially echoing what we've discussed about in the essays of Brutus, another anti-federalist paper, the Impartial Examiner says, hey, the supremacy clause is going to be used to make the federal government more powerful than the state governments, therefore making certain parts of the state governments, aka their bills of rights, totally unimportant. Therefore, the federal government will accumulate power and essentially dissolve the states altogether. Now, he does actually at this point reference the Federalist Papers, which he refers to one of Hamilton's papers as he said, he calls him a zealous advocate in a northern state. And I thought that was very funny. Again, when he was talking about the Bill of Rights, and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers argues against the need for a Bill of Rights in the Constitution in the Federalist Papers. And the Impartial Examiner is very directly attacking that. Again, this is in Virginia, the most powerful state, just on the eve of their ratification convention, doing their best to try and halt Virginia's participation in the Union. And very closely so. Virginia would go on to only have a 10-vote divide when they finally voted. So that is a very, very, very brief overview of the Impartial Examiner's first essay.